much. My name is Kathryn Harrison, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here this afternoon. I'm a professor of political science at the University of British Columbia. I have something of an unusual academic background with bachelor's and master's degrees in chemical engineering and a second master's and a PhD in political science. At UBC, my research and teaching focuses on environmental and specifically climate policy, primarily in Canada and the United States. I've written or edited 5 books, the most recent of which was a comparison of climate change policy in 7 jurisdictions. We academics typically have specialized expertise. Mine is in chemical engineering, Canadian federalism, and environmental policy design. But just like everyone else, academics also have values, hopes for our own, our children's, and the planet's future. I don't think my values are particularly different from everyone else's, nor are they more important. I'm just one Canadian voter, one global citizen, with no greater significance than anyone else. The biggest difference, I think, between the experts and those who don't have as specialized knowledge in a particular area is that our expertise means that we know that the academic community has achieved remarkably strong agreement, that climate change is already having devastating impacts and will get much worse, that we urgently need to make deep reductions in our greenhouse gas emissions if we are to avert irreversible and disastrous impacts on human well-being, and that we already have the policy tools available to put us on that alternative path. Canadian academics also know the ways that our country continues to head in the wrong direction. We have not adopted the necessary policies to reduce our own emissions, and we are continuing to build an economy predicated on fossil fuels, both for our own and others' consumption. So the biggest difference, I think, between academics and other Canadians is that we're not just a little concerned, as the pollsters ask in public opinion polls, we're terrified. Although I could give you all kinds of numbers and scenarios and talk about the Constitution, instead I'm going to use my remaining time and make this very personal. I'd like to tell you 3 little stories, and I'll keep them short because I know time is short. The first is how I came to become a chemical engineer. I have a remarkably clear memory of my beloved grade 7 teacher in London, Ontario, pointing to northern Alberta on the map of Canada and saying, "Everybody talks about our water and our mountains, but this is what really makes Canada special. We have this amazing resource, and when we figure out how to develop it, it will be our greatest contribution to the world." That was pretty heady stuff for a little girl in 1969. So I worked really hard to do my part. I worked in the oil fields in the summer as a student. I graduated at the top of my class in chemical engineering. I spent the first 2 years of my career conducting research in support of the design of the tar sands upgrader and Shell Canada's Scotford refinery, the first refinery in the world that was designed to process entirely synthetic crude from bitumen. Obviously, along the way, I took a pretty big turn, and that's because so did the scientific community. 4 decades later, we know so much more. We know that the resource my teacher so proudly pointed to does not hold great promise for the planet. Rather, the carbon in Canada's tar sands is more like dynamite. And just because we're selling it to someone else and they're the ones lighting the fuse does not make us any less culpable for the devastation that will result. The other thing that changed over the intervening years is that I had 2 children, and my second story is about them. When they were 10 years old, they weren't learning with great pride about the wonderful potential of Canada's fossil fuel reserves. They were learning that their country's insistence on exploiting those reserves will hinder their future and that of the planet. They love this country as much as I do, and as I'm sure you and we all do. But instead of growing up with a sense of pride and optimism, they're ashamed and they're frightened for their future. But to their credit, they've done something about it. They started a group called Kids for Climate Action, and though they're not old enough to vote, this group of remarkable young people has put on flash mobs, 70-kilometer bike rides to Victoria, and political rallies, all asking and indeed pleading with adults to do a better job of looking out for their future. On any given rainy Thursday night in Vancouver, you can find 5 to 20 of these teenagers standing on busy street corners, talking to adults, one at a time, to get them to commit as voters to support stronger measures to reduce British Columbia's and Canada's contribution to climate change. It's heartbreaking because we just keep letting them down. but it's also inspiring, or I think it should be, to those of us like me and like all of you who are in a position to do more. My last story is about a very different group of children. In 2011, I volunteered as a teacher in a preschool in a slum in India. I've seen a lot of the world, but I've never witnessed anything even close to the poverty that these children live in. They don't have enough to eat, they don't have shoes, let alone health care. Their extended families, up to 10 people, live on less than $2 per day. In one room, lean-tos made of corrugated metal with a scrap piece of cloth for a door. They have no running water, they have no toilets. Global climate modeling predicts that temperature increases will be greatest in the southern hemisphere. Countries like India also are more vulnerable to those temperature increases, given the challenges of tropical disease, low-lying, densely populated cities, and vulnerable infrastructure. Those kids, not mine or yours, are the ones who will suffer most from our inaction on climate change and our willingness to continue trading without constraint in fossil fuels. When we have extreme storms in North America, we get flooding in our subways. When they get extreme storms, their homes and what little they have is completely lost. You've no doubt noticed that I haven't said anything about the potential for pipeline breaks and tanker spills, about which you've heard so much. And I too worry a lot about these things, especially as a British Columbian who loves to paddle on the coast, hike in the wilderness, and who's concerned about the economic well-being of my fellow British Columbians. But my greatest fear with the Enbridge Mode and Gateway project is not the potential for a local environmental disaster. It's that everything will go right. The oil will safely travel across British Columbia, be loaded without mishap onto tankers, and those ships will make it safely to Asia where it will be burned. And that will be the greatest environmental disaster. Although the combustion will occur halfway around the world, it will hurt those of us who are adults today. It will hurt those incredibly vulnerable children in India, and it will hurt our own children. And of course, the numbers and the details do matter, but with respect to climate change, it's not that complicated. The bitumen that will be transported through the Enbridge Northern Gateway pipeline will contribute almost 90 million tons per year of CO2 to the global atmosphere. That's considerably more than British Columbia emits every year. There are, of course, the arguments that if we don't sell our customers the oil, someone else will. And to that, I have two responses. It's a matter of building a new pipeline that will have a projected life of many decades. In approving that pipeline, we are locking ourselves into a fossil fuel path for decades, at a time when the International Energy Agency warns that we only have 5 years to start reducing global emissions. In so doing, we're also wasting scarce resources on fossil fuel infrastructure that we need to invest in alternate energy sources if we're going to make that happen. Second, at the end of the day, it's about values, our moral obligations to our children. We know that the bitumen flowing through that pipeline will contribute significantly to global climate change. Is that the kind of trade we want our economic prosperity to be predicated on? If it were a massive export of asbestos or tobacco to Asia, would we be so quick to say, well, it's legal and it's profitable, so that's our customer's problem? This is a critical juncture for the planet, and this project is a critical juncture for our country, and you have a critical role to play in that decision. If this pipeline is built, our children will not thank us for the short-term prosperity we were able to provide by digging up our lands and shipping out fossil fuels. I think that they will ask us what on earth we were thinking in selling out their futures for so damn cheap. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you for listening to me, panel. I'm a resident of Coquitlam, BC. I've been a BC resident since 1973. I'm speaking on my own behalf and also on behalf of fellow members of my sea kayaking club called the Sea Kayak Association of BC. I've been a member about 7 years, and we have about 250 members. They're all ocean kayak enthusiasts, of course. They're a mix of young and old, but as with a lot of recreational clubs these days, grey hairs tend to dominate a bit. But they're from all walks of life, and they have a common love of the coast and travelling in unreasonably small boats. My club has never actually addressed